Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. These are new things that we're doing. We're using Crowdcast. So if there are technical difficulties, please forgive me. I'm Christine from Two Rivers Bookstore. We're in the Portland neighborhood of St. John's. It's a little bookstore where we have great books, great events, and we also have a yarn shop in our store. So we also have knitting events and Stitch and Bitch. I put a link to our website in the chat. You can see all the books that we're talking about today in the chat. We like to focus on hyper-local, which is why I brought on Marty from OSU Publishing to talk about the new books that they're releasing or have released. Some of them have already been out in the world. So this is Marty Brown from Oregon State University Press, and I'm so happy that you could make it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Christine.
You're welcome.
Since it's happy hour, I brought a beverage. I brought a cider from Two Town Cider House in Corvallis on Highway 34. I think they're still there. I haven't driven on Highway 34 in a long time.
I haven't either, but I know that that is a very popular cider, especially around here. And I usually have a glass of wine from 45th Parallel, but it's been a busy day today, so I didn't get out.
It's only Thursday.
It's only Thursday. It feels like there's 100 days in a week now. But let's talk about the books.
Yes.
Should
I just dive in?
Yeah, just dive in. The abalone one, it looks awesome.
Well, let's start with Abalone. This is our most recent release, Abalone, the remarkable history and uncertain future of California's iconic shellfish. So this book is really a deep dive, pun intended, into the history of the abalone, which is a mollusk or a shellfish. And if charismatic is a word that can describe a mollusk, then the abalone definitely qualifies. If you like Mark Kurlaski's books, Cod or Salt, this is similar in that it's kind of viewing history through the lens of a particular object or animal, in this case, abalone, which is native to the coast of California from, all the way from Mexico up into sort of southern Oregon, which is where the author lives. Anne Valises studied history at Yale, so she's a trained historian, but she's also an independent scholar, and she writes a lot about the history of food. So it's a very accessibly written book, and it covers everything from early native practices with the abalone, arts and crafts, the value of the abalone spiritually and materially to the native cultures. And then it really delves deep into the California beach culture that started to emerge in the 1950s and 60s, surfers, and abalone was actually very instrumental to the development of the sport of skin diving. And then it goes from there into turf wars that started taking place between skin divers and commercial fisher people, and ends up in the modern day with sort of the conservation issues. The abalone is now endangered and imperiled. So this is really a broad overview with a lot of interesting detail about the way this one shellfish, which most of us know for its iridescent shell. I don't know about you, but I grew up in the 70s when everybody had abalone ashtrays, which is not the most beautiful image, but it's also used a lot in jewelry. So that's how we think of it, but it's also very important as a food. And it's a beautiful creature, it's a beautiful animal, and it's a beautiful book. So natural history, cultural history, kind of all wound up together.
Yeah, she writes a lot of cultural history, right? The previous book was kitchen
literacy.
Kitchen literacy. I was going to say kitchen language, but literacy. Yeah.
Yeah. So the history of food and environment. A lot of those books, a lot of that, those topics.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that one. And I'm going to the coast this weekend, and the abalone don't go up this far north. Otherwise, I'd be looking for them.
Yeah. I used to live in the Bay Area and work for the University of California Press. And There were a lot of people I knew who were diving for abalone when they probably shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I don't know if you can do that anymore.
No, I don't know.
Because it's endangered.
Yeah.
It was definitely a big part of Northern California beach culture for a long time.
Yeah.
So that's abalone. That's our most recent release. I'm going to zip back in time a little bit to April, which was Poetry Month. And we came out with a paperback edition of the collected poems of Hazel Hall. And this book is especially appropriate right now with COVID-19, I think, because so much of Hazel Hall's experience as a poet was about isolation. Hazel Hall was a early 20th century poet in Portland. She published widely in the 20s. She had a childhood illness which caused her to be disabled, and she lived her life in a wheelchair, and her family had difficulty navigating the wheelchair down the stairs of their home in Northwest Portland. So she spent most of her life on the second floor looking out a window, and she propped a mirror in the window so she could better see the passersby, and she earns money doing needlepoint and needlework. So there's a lot of poetry in here about needlework as a metaphor for living, and there's also a lot about isolation. I want to read just one poem. I'm not much of a poetry reader, but I think this is just, we can all relate right now about looking out through a window and watching the world go past or not. So this poem is called Nobody Passes. Nobody passes on the street. The day is set like a stage for feet, with a ridge of white clouds painted high across the canvas of the sky, with pavement gleaming and too clean, a shimmer of grass that seems too green, and houses alert on every side, showing a stiff and conscious pride. The day is a stage and life is a play, but nobody passes down this way.
And it's the 100th anniversary, right? That's
her first poetry collection was called Curtains, and it was published in 1921. So we're coming up on the 100th anniversary. She was widely known in her lifetime, published widely. She was known as the Emily Dickinson of the West, partly because of, they were similarly isolated and wrote about, kind of a very narrow worldview that expanded out really to speak to our larger humanity. And some of her verses are just strikingly modern for a 20th century poet. She's not a modernist, but some of her poetry is very, very contemporary feeling. So I highly recommend Hazel Hall. And this is a public service announcement. If you happen to be in Portland, there's a little boutique called Noun at the corner of 33rd and Belmont that currently has a window display based on Hazel Hall's poetry. So,
oh, that's awesome.
And it's worth checking out if you happen to walk around in Southeast Portland and see that.
Yay. That sounds great.
So moving from isolation into remote, which was sort of an accident that this book was released the first week of April when we all began working remotely. Remote is a memoir written by Debbie Lee, DJ Lee, who's an author in Moscow, Idaho. She's an English teacher and an archivist and a wilderness person. So this book, I just love this book. It weaves together different aspects of her family history and the challenges of being in the wilderness. If you liked, Wild, Cheryl Strayed, there's a lot of books about women in the wilderness, but this one sort of weaves together a lot of different layers in a way that's so compelling. And the Bitterroot Wilderness extends, it's one of the largest roadless areas in all of the United States. It's very, very deep wilderness. It extends from Idaho into Montana. And DJ goes looking. I love stories where there are boxes. There's like she inherits a box from her grandmother that's full of photographs and letters, and starts trying to piece together the history of her family and the Bitterroots. Her grandparents were early settlers, and they tended Moose Lodge way up in the Bitterroots. It's very remote. And so she tries to piece together the story of her grandparents. And while she's trekking in the back country, she has a friend who's a teacher, her wilderness guide, who disappears and goes missing. So that's another aspect of the story. And I'm not going to tell you how everything works out, but this is just a beautifully written memoir. wilderness experience and family story with a little bit of mystery.
Yeah, I met Debbie at PNBA last fall, and I read the book, and I absolutely loved it. And I have been haunted by the Bitterroot mountain range ever since. I still want to get out there someday. It's not friendly territory, right? It's like really rough. And I have a friend who's a truck driver, and every time he goes past the Bitterroot Mountains, he sends a photograph. He's like, the Bitterroot. And I'm like, oh. But it's amazing that there were settlers there, and the story that it's not a story, it's a memoir, but it's just amazing how she weaves in all of the roughness and then the family dynamics. And she's a really good writer.
It's a great read. Definitely.
It's a great read. Yeah.
Keeping on the theme of wilderness, this book is also a memoir. It's called Black and Green, Gloria Brown and the Unwritten Trail to Forest Service Leadership. This is Gloria Brown's story about rising through the ranks of the U.S. Forest Service, and she became the first African-American woman to attain the rank of forest supervisor in the Forest Service. It's a very inspiring story. She started out as a clerk, a clerical worker in the Washington, D.C. Home Office. She's from Washington, D.C. She's an urban African-American woman. She was working for the Forest Service as a young woman with 3 children. She was married, and she became a widow at a very young age, just as soon as she was finishing up her degree in journalism. And she decided she couldn't afford a journalism career, so she would try to rise through the ranks of the Forest Service. And as part of doing that, she came out west, and she had no wilderness experience at all. She was like born and bred DC, and she came out west and just fell in love with the mountains. And she worked in Montana for a while and encountered, some pretty horrifying racism with her and her children, and had some bad experiences. And so she talks very frankly about that in this book. But so it's by turns really, hard to read at sometimes because of that, because she's very honest about the racism that she encounters. But it's also very inspiring. She, from Montana, went up to Mount St. Helens, and she became the supervisor of the National Monument up there. She was the supervisor of the Los Padres National Forest down in California, and the Sayusla, which is near our hometown in Corvallis. It's just a really inspiring story. And again, it's very honest. There are hard parts about what it takes, the extra work that somebody of color has to do in order to fit in a culture at the Forest Service, which is still very white and very male. So, and this is very easy. It's an easy read. It'll inspire you and make you want to get out in the wilderness.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. That sort of is a good lead in. Next Thursday, we're doing Recess with a new nonprofit called Reading is Resistance, which is about diversity and social justice and inclusion, and how to have conversations with children about it, how parents can broach the subject. So I'm going to bring that book up.
Dude, there's a lot of good stuff in there. And she even delves into, she did during her career move back and forth between the West and the Home Office in DC. And she talks about supervising African Americans at the Home Office and how difficult that could be when her Black colleagues weren't performing up to standards, So it's very complicated. It's a very nuanced story that she tells.
Wow. That sounds great.
She's just an inspiring person. If you ever have her in the store, she's just very charming, and you can see how she compelled people to want to follow her.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I don't know when we'll have people in the store again. Hopefully someday.
I want to finish up by talking about a book that's not published yet. This book is coming out in September, late September. This is a memoir. It's called Rough House by Tina Ontiveros, who's a writing instructor at Columbia Gorge Community College in the Gorge. I read this book. This is an advanced reading copy. if you read Educated by Tara Westover, this book is very similar, but I think it's better. It's a story about growing up in a poor and abusive family and overcoming that and defining your adulthood on your own terms. And the way she writes it, it's written with such love. There's no, sorry, I'm tearing up just thinking about this. I read this the other night and it literally made me cry. Partly that's because the landscape is so familiar. Her story is set. It ranges from Idaho down to Southern Oregon, and most of it takes place sort of in Western Washington, Yakima, the Dalles, and Centralia, Chehalis area, Morton, Yakima. So the Western Cascades, which is an area that I'm familiar with personally. So a lot of these landscapes and a lot of this culture just really rung true for me, but it's just so beautifully written and such a powerful story. And I don't say that lightly. I'm a skeptical reader usually. I go in saying, okay, show me, prove to me, and she delivers. So Tina Ontiveros, it's just so, God, what is the word I want? It's so honest and unaffected, and it's a very powerful story about love and the bonds of family.
You did a great job with the cover of that book. It's a really,
I love this cover.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous cover.
There's some Easter eggs. So part of the story is her family lived in makeshift housing, which looked, often much like this. And her father would sort of build on additions to the trailers. And a little couple secrets about this cover. This is actually the Oregon-Washington border here. I don't know if you caught that little Easter egg.
Wow,
For the people who know, it's the line of the Columbia.
That's awesome.
So watch for this one in September. Watch for Tina Ontiveros and Rough House. This book is going to make you cry. If it made me cry, it'll make you cry.
Yeah. Maybe we should do a virtual event with her.
I bet we could.
Yeah, that would be great. If anybody has any questions, you can drop them in the chat. Otherwise, this will stay up. We will hopefully have more people who view this over the coming week. The books are available on our website, tworiversbooks.com. And then one other quick PSA, the first Friday of every month, we're doing singer-songwriter night, and we have converted it to virtual. So if you don't have anything to do, this first Friday of June, which I think is June 4th, 7 p.m., tune into our Crowdcast singer-songwriter night. And thank you, Marty, for doing this test with us.
Thank you, Christine. It's good to see you.
Thanks for the happy hour. What are we reading for fun or escape right now? Ooh. I'm reading Glennon Doyle's Untamed. Pretty awesome. Marty, what are you reading besides Rough House?
I am reading March by Geraldine Brooks.
Ooh.
It's an old one, and I
never
got around to reading it. So I have a little Concord Alcott fetish. So that's what I'm reading.
Interesting. I'll have to keep that in mind. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks for participating, all you OSU folks.
Good to see everyone.
Hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.